Welcome to Lecture 6 on Learning. So we're going to continue talking about operant conditioning. A psychologist named B.F. Skinner continued researching operant conditioning, and he discovered how the timing of reinforcement or punishment could further change behavior. Now remember that a reinforcer is defined as a stimulus that occurs after a response and increases the likelihood that a response will be repeated. A punishment is a stimulus that occurs after a response and decreases the likelihood that a response will be repeated. So Skinner did a lot of research using a box that he developed, and it's called the Skinner box. He worked a lot with pigeons. So Skinner set up a box, and he wanted to see how he could teach pigeons to peck a certain number of times, or press a lever a certain number of times, or stop pressing a lever. And so he set up a box like this that would use food as a reinforcer and would gradually train these pigeons to do whatever task it is that he wanted them to learn. So I want you to go to the folder Chapter 6 Learning Lecture Videos on Moodle and watch an example of a Skinner box. Welcome back. So Skinner was looking a lot at more complex behaviors. He wanted to look at how we can shape a sequence of behaviors for a large overall behavior. So Skinner realized that complex behaviors, like learning a maze, could be shaped and chained. So you can shape behaviors by reinforcing successive approximations to it. And you start with this first behavior. So let's say you want to teach your puppy to roll over. Well, you can't just, use a rolling motion with your hand and expect the puppy to understand what you mean. You actually have to train to shape your puppy's behavior using successive approximations. So at first you're going to get the puppy to lay down, but then you're going to get it to lay down on its side. You reinforce and reinforce, and then you get it to lay on its back. You reinforce, and then you get it to turn onto its side. And then you get it to tie all those behaviors together. And that's shaping. You start with the first behavior to learn a complex behavior. Now you can also chain behaviors using successive behaviors and using reinforcements, but you go in the opposite direction. You start with the last behavior. So I'd like you to go to Moodle, and in the folder Chapter 6 Learning Lecture Videos, watch B.F. Skinner Foundation Pigeon Turn, and A Pigeon Solves the Classic Box and Banana Problem. Welcome back. I really like the box and banana problem. I think it's a really good example of how complex behaviors have to be shaped. The pigeon had to learn small behaviors and then shape them together to actually get from understanding to move that it needs to move the box to the right part of it needs to move the box that it'll stand on to the right part of the training box, and it needs to flip it in order to get the banana. So reinforcers can be two types. There's primary reinforcers, and these satisfy basic biological needs. And then there's secondary reinforcers. Now these don't directly satisfy biological needs. We learn them so that we can meet basic biological needs. And we learn these secondary reinforcers through operant conditioning. You can also call secondary reinforcers conditioned reinforcers. So a reinforcer that becomes a secondary reinforcer is a reinforcer that becomes attractive because it has been associated with a previous primary reinforcer. So you, let's see, you get a job so that you can afford food, you can afford shelter, you can meet your very basic biological needs. Now, David Premack came up with the Premack principle, and it's pretty straightforward. This principle suggests that more valued activities can be used to reinforce less valued activities. It's kind of like dangling the carrot. So, an example, if you make, you're trying to get your 7-year-old to be better about making her bed every morning. So if she makes her bed for a week, every day she gets to go see a movie on Saturday. If you go to your job and you get an income, you get to meet your daily needs and wants. So if we reinforce less valued activities, that allows us to obtain valued activities. Now, researchers and the behaviorists that were researching operant conditioning realized that the timing of reinforcement and punishment greatly affects what's being learned, how quickly it's learned, and how long that behavior lasts. So let's look at a couple of those. Continuous reinforcement leads to rapid learning, but is rare outside of the laboratory. So continuous reinforcement means every time you engage in that behavior, you get your reinforcement. Every single time. Life just doesn't give us the opportunity to be reinforced every time we engage in a behavior. But continuous reinforcement just means that every time you exhibit a behavior, you're reinforced. So partial reinforcements are more common. And there's 4 different types. There's fixed interval, variable interval, fixed ratio, and variable ratio schedules of reinforcement. The schedule used impacts how persistent the behavior is. Now, sometimes this gets a little confusing, so I've tried to be really clear with my notes on how this works, but there's also some really good videos. So I would like you to go to, which folder you need right now, and watch the video, Learning Schedules of Reinforcement. Welcome back. So, sorry, just a second. We're looking at ratio and interval scheduling. Now, a ratio schedule is a schedule in which reinforcement is based on the number of times a behavior occurs. A variable schedule is a schedule in which reinforcement is given after a specific amount of time. So ratio is about the number of times a behavior occurs. Variable is based on the amount of time. So fixed ratios. Fixed ratio is a type of reinforcement. Fixed ratios when you're using a fixed ratio, reinforcement is given after a fixed number of responses. So, if you decide to reinforce every 4th behavior, with a fixed ratio, it's every 4th behavior. And you have to be very consistent with that. Now, the behaviors as they're, when it comes to learning and the demonstration of newly learned behaviors, the response rate with fixed ratio is rapid. The behavior is learned quite quickly, and it's steady. There's not very many pauses between trials. The subject learns this behavior rapidly and very steadily. So some examples would be doing 20 sit-ups. Or if you're going to walk up this flight of stairs, you have to go up the same number of stairs to get to the landing. The mailman must visit the same number of mailboxes each day in order to go home. So those are examples of fixed ratios. Fixed interval is when the first correct response that occurs after a fixed time interval is reinforced. So this time we're not looking at the number of behaviors. We're looking at the amount of time between behaviors. So with fixed interval reinforcement, response is low at the beginning, but it increases as the subject gets closer to the time of reinforcement. So some examples: getting a paycheck at the end of the week, picking up the paper in the morning after it's been delivered at the same time every day, getting a paycheck at the end of the week. Sorry about that, that's a duplicate. I do that a lot, and I apologize. So fixed interval means it's a fixed amount of time between reinforcements. So this chart gives you a good look at, we're doing ratios right now. We have variable ratio and fixed ratio. So each slash is where the behavior is reinforced. So, example of variable ratio. A slot machine pays off, on average, every few pulls, but you never know which pull is going to pay off. Variable ratio is very, very effective when you want a behavior to be learned quickly. Since the subject doesn't know when they're going to be reinforced, they just keep giving the behavior. They can't predict it. A fixed ratio, you are paid each time you complete a chore. Pretty straightforward. The response is pretty rapid and doesn't take long to learn. Now we get to variable ratio. This is where reinforcement is given after a variable number of correct responses. So this is all centered around averages. With variable ratio reinforcement, the response is steady. It takes a little more time, and you can only use a couple pauses between trials. You need to be very consistent with reinforcing this average. So examples, using a slot machine at a gambling casino, or buying a lottery ticket. You never know when you're going to win, and let's face it, with the lottery, but gambling games are excellent examples of fixed ratios. If you keep playing, you're likely to get the prize. So that's variable ratio. It's the amount of time, reinforcement is given after a variable number of correct responses that's settled around an average. Variable interval is based on time. So reinforcement is given for the first response that occurs after a variable time interval. Now, when you use variable interval schedules, the response is slow, but it is steady. You want to make sure you're not using a lot of pauses. So some examples of variable interval reinforcements. Speed traps on the highway. You know they're there. You know that they're there. Surprise quizzes. If I tell you there's going to be surprise quizzes throughout the term, there are going to be surprise quizzes, and that's going to shape how you study. Random drug testing is an excellent example of variable interval reinforcement. So variable interval reinforcement is given for the first response that occurs after a variable time interval. So here we have variable interval. So the example, you listen to the radio to hear your favorite song, but you don't know when you're going to hear your favorite song. You know it'll happen, so you just keep listening. Fixed interval. When quizzes are scheduled at fixed intervals, students study only when the quiz is going to be administered. The grade is the reinforcer. So let's see, this next test is due Monday for those taking it this summer. Chances are you're probably not listening to this until Saturday night, maybe Sunday afternoon. That's okay. Now, extinction will happen, like we talked about with classical conditioning. A classically conditioned response, learned behavior can become extinguished, where it just kind of dies off. With the partial reinforcement extinction effect with operant conditioning, the greater persistence of behavior under partial reinforcement, you get greater persistence of behavior under partial reinforcement than under continuous reinforcement. I think this makes a lot of sense. Behavior modification. This is the use of operant conditioning techniques to eliminate unwanted behaviors and replace them with desirable behaviors. When we're looking at timing and schedules of reinforcement, we do see differences. Variable interval and variable ratio and fixed ratio give different results. Variable interval and fixed interval give different results when it comes to how that behavior is learned. Skinner believed that all behaviors could be explained by conditioning principles. Behaviorists, especially back 50s, the 60s, the 70s, were very stringent about this. This comes back to there is no such thing as free will. Strict behaviorists believe that every single thing is a learned behavior, that there is no innate aspects to the human experience. But we know that biology constrains learning, and that reinforcement does not always have to be present for learning to occur. We're evolutionarily predisposed to certain behaviors. We have biological limits. So some examples. Just try to stop a cat from purring. It's not going to happen. They are evolutionarily predisposed to purring when they are content. Try to stop a squirrel from digging. It's not going to happen. Digging is part of their food process. Try to stop a dog from sniffing. That's not going to happen. Try to get it to stop sniffing your friend's butt. That's probably not going to happen either. We are evolutionarily predisposed to certain behaviors. We do have biological constraints, as do our animal subjects. So not everything has to be learned. Some behaviors are just innate. Now, Edward Tolman looked at how reinforcement has more impact on performance than on learning. I'm going to have you read about Tolman in the textbook because I need to cut this lecture off in just a second. So I'm going to let you read that in the book. And then I want you to look at his study with the training of rats. It's a fascinating study. I really like this study. So please make sure you take a look at that in your textbook. I think you'll find it interesting too. And that brings us to latent learning. And this is learning that takes place in the absence of reinforcement. We don't always have to be reinforced to learn. When we are not reinforced, we still learn. And reinforcement simply encourages us to demonstrate what we've learned. But we're not always dependent on being reinforced to actually learn a behavior. A lot of the time we are, but okay, so that's it for operant conditioning. In the next lecture, we're going to look at learning by observation, and we're almost done with the chapter.